An important perspective on the concept of alienation is provided by two meta-attitudes that are in play throughout the final two-thirds of the Spirit chapter. Hegel's term for these attitudes is edelmütig and niederträchtig. Miller translates these as noble and base. I take it that a better way to think about the contrast is that between generous and mean-spirited, or magnanimous and pusillanimous, literally great-souled and small-souled. But because the rich content that Hegel is to give them and wants them to convey goes beyond those expressed by any of these labels, I'm generally just going to leave the terms in German. They refer to meta-attitudes because they're attitudes towards the relation between norms, or normative statuses, such as commitments, responsibilities, and authority, on the one hand, and attitudes of acknowledging or attributing such norms as binding or applicable. As I understand it, the edelmütig meta-attitude takes it that there really are norms, that attitudes are directed toward and answer to. It treats norms as genuinely efficacious, as really making a difference to what individuals do. It understands attitudes as norm-governed, in the dual sense that norms provide standards for assessment of the correctness of attitudes, and that attitudes are subjunctively sensitive to the contents of norms. If the norm were different, the attitude would be different. Attitudes, paradigmatically the acknowledgement or attribution of a norm as binding, taking oneself or another to be committed or responsible, practically distinguishing between performances that are appropriate and those that are not, are the way the norms are actualized, the way they become efficacious, how they make things happen in the causal order. The niederträchtig meta-attitude sees only normative attitudes. The norms are construed as at most adverbial modifications of the attitudes, a way of talking about the contents of those attitudes by assigning them virtual objects. Niederträchtigkeit is the purest expression of the alienated character of modern normativity, hence modern culture, self-consciousness, and community. The two meta-attitudes of Edelmütigkeit and Niederträchtigkeit are initially both manifestations of alienation, because they seize one-sidedly on the unity of knowing and acting consciousness in the one hand, and the distinction that it involves on the other. Because the defining flaw of modernity is its failure to get the unity and the distinction that knowing and acting consciousness involve in focus together in one picture, the way forward to the reachievement of unalienated Sittlichkeit is a kind of higher Edelmütigkeit. On the theoretical side, that's coming to apply metaconceptual categories of Vernunft rather than those of Verstand. Hegel's account of what that consists in is the core achievement, I think, of his philosophy. As we draw closer to the end of his exposition in the Phenomenology, we get a new vantage point on that structure of unalienated understanding. The clearest expression of the new piece of the puzzle comes in a famous passage about playing the moral valet. Valet here is Kammerdiener, and I call this crucial stretch of text the Kammerdiener passage. It expresses a cardinal form of Niederträchtigkeit, holding fast to the disparity that action involves. I'm going to read this long quote. It holds to the other aspect and explains the action as resulting from an intention different from the action itself and from selfish motives. Just as every action is capable of being looked at from the point of view of conformity to duty, so too it can be considered from the point of view of the particularity of the doer. For qua action, it is the actuality of the individual. This judging of the action thus takes it out of its outer existence and reflects it into its inner aspect, or into the form of its own particularity. If the action is accompanied by fame, then it knows this inner aspect to be a desire for fame. If it's altogether in keeping with the station of the individual, without going beyond this station, and of such a nature that the individuality does not possess its station as a character externally attached to it, but through its own self gives filling to this universality, then showing itself capable of a higher station, then the inner aspect of the action is judged to be ambition, and so on. Since in the action as such, the doer attains to a vision of himself in objectivity, or to a feeling of self in his existence, and thus to enjoyment, the inner aspect is judged to be an urge to secure his own happiness, even though this were to consist merely in an inner moral conceit, in the enjoyment of being conscious of his own superiority, and in the foretaste of a hope of future happiness. No action can escape such judgment. For duty's sake, this pure purpose is an unreality. It becomes a reality in the deed of an individuality, and the action is thereby charged with this aspect of particularity. No man is a hero to his valet. Not, however, because the man is not a hero, but because the valet is a valet, whose dealings are with the man not as a hero, but as one who eats, drinks, and wears clothes, in general with his individual wants and fancies. Thus, for the judging consciousness, there is no action in which it could not oppose to the universal aspect of the action the personal aspect of the individuality, and play the part of the moral valet to the agent. End of that quote. This is a rich and I think important passage. I see its significance as unfolding in a series of concentric, widening ripples, and I want to follow them as they broaden out from their center. To be a hero, in the sense in play here, is to act out of regard for one's duty. That is to have one's actions proceed from respect for or acknowledgement of the authority of norms. The hero is the one who acknowledges a norm as binding by actualizing it, who does what he ought because he ought. To play the valet to such a hero is to impute only selfish, particular motives, to trace every action back to some perceived personal advantage, be it only reputation for virtue, or where even that is not available, the satisfaction of thinking well of oneself. In any case, only particular attitudes are acknowledged, not governing norms. Consider the official who exercises state power. He's committed himself to act purely according to universal interests or norms. That is, he commits himself to doing only what acknowledgement of the norms requires. But every actual performance is a particular doing, and so incorporates contingency. It's always more than just the acknowledgement of a norm, and it may well always be less than that. After all, I can never just turn on the light or feed the poor. I'm always also doing other things, perhaps alerting the burglar, or cutting the education budget, or raising taxes. Contingent motives and interests will always also be in play. So it'll always be possible for the niederträchtig consciousness to point out the moment of disparity, the particularity and contingency that infects each action. It's never just an instance of the universal. The Kammerdiener can always explain what the hero of service did in terms of self-interested, hence particular contingent motives and interests, rather than as a response to an acknowledged normative necessity. There's no action at all that is not amenable to this sort of reductive, ignoble description. Broadening our horizons a little bit, I think we can see an issue being raised concerning the relations between norms and attitudes quite generally. The Kammerdiener does not appeal to norms in his explanations of behavior. The attitudes of individuals are enough. The public official says that he acted as he did because it was his duty. The Kammerdiener offers a competing explanation that appeals only to his desires. What his duty actually is, what he ought to do, plays no role in this account. Thought of at this level of generality, the moral psychological valet stands for a kind of nihilism about norms that has been more recently championed by Gilbert Harman for the special case of moral norms. According to this view, invoking moral norms or values is explanatorily odious, unnecessary. For we can offer explanations of everything that actually happens in terms of people's views about what is right and wrong, what they take to be permissible or obligatory. It's those attitudes, Harman claims, that are causally efficacious, and those attitudes, believing that it's wrong to steal, for instance, would have just the same causal consequences whether or not there were facts to which they corresponded, whether or not it is in fact wrong to steal. Nor is the case any different if we look upstream to the antecedents of moral attitudes rather than downstream to the consequences. My belief that it's wrong to steal was brought about by other beliefs, along with other attitudes such as desires. Some of them are my own, some held by my parents and teachers. The truth of the belief need not be invoked to explain why I have the belief, or why anyone else has it. In this way, moral beliefs, normative attitudes, contrast with the perceptual beliefs expressed by non-inferential reports, for which the frequent truth of such beliefs must be appealed to, both in explaining why we have those beliefs and in explaining why having those beliefs has the consequences it does. So Harman argues. Acts of applying concepts in judgment and intentional action, and acts of assessing such applications form a complete explanatory structure, one that's capable of accounting for what people do without needing to be supplemented by reference to the conceptual norms or standards that are supposedly being applied, and with respect to which applications are supposedly being assessed. Because we do not need to appeal to norms, the best explanation of our actions and attitudes appeals only to attitudes. So, Harman thinks, we should conclude that there are no norms, only attitudes. This approach sees a massive error standing behind our ordinary way of talking about norms. Another way to look at the issue is to ask what sort of theory of practical reasoning the Kammerdiner's meta-attitude depends on. It's one that eschews what are sometimes called external reasons. A broadly Kantian form of practical reasoning and explanation appeals to inferences such as the following. It's wrong to steal. Taking that newspaper would be stealing, so I shall not take that newspaper. Here the norm, the wrongness of stealing, serves as a premise and a piece of practical reasoning that can be appealed to in deliberation about what to do, assessment of what has been done, prediction of what will be done, and explanation of what was done. That's the sort of practical reasoning to which the edelmütig meta-attitude appeals when it sees the official and the counselor acting out of respect for and obedience to communal norms. A broadly Humean approach to practical reasoning, of the sort endorsed by Donald Davidson, insists that the Kantian radically misrepresents the reasons that actually motivate intentional action. Even if the first premise states a fact, even if it's wrong to steal, that fact would not by itself engage with my motivational machinery. To do that, the Davidsonian claims, I must know about or at least believe in the fact. The real reason in the vicinity is that I believe that it's wrong to steal. Apart from that belief, the wrongness of stealing is nothing to me and cannot affect what I go on to do or try to do. Once we've added that belief as a premise, the original invocation of the norm can drop out. The Humean principle is that only beliefs and desires, only individual attitudes, can serve as motivating reasons. Norms can't. The idea is that what serve as reasons for action must also be causes, and only attitudes, such as beliefs and desires, can do that. The issue here concerns the practical conception of the pragmatic notion of normative force. How should norms, what is or is not appropriate, correct, obligatory, permissible, or normative statuses, responsibility, authority, commitment, entitlement, on the one hand, be understood as related to normative attitudes, taking performances to be appropriate, correct, obligatory, or permissible, acknowledging or attributing responsibility, authority, commitment, and entitlement on the other. The traditional pre-modern view saw norms as independent and attitudes as dependent. The objective norms have authority over the subjective attitudes of individuals, which are supposed merely to reflect them, acknowledge their authority, apply them in deliberation and assessment, judgment, and action. The modern view sees attitudes as independent and norms as dependent. The subjective attitudes individuals adopt, indeed, institute the norms. The selfish particular motives that are all the Kammerdiener attributes are independently authoritative attitudes that can be reflected only in statuses such as usefulness to private purposes, not in statuses such as duty or being unconditionally obligatory, in the sense that the obligatoriness is authoritative for attitudes rather than conditioned on them, as the hypothetical instrumental imperatives arising from prudent pursuit of privately endorsed ends. The Kammerdiener banishes talk of values that are not immediately the products of individual valuings. The rise of subjectivity is the practical realization that values are not independent of valuings. Quintessential alienated later modern thinkers, such as Nietzsche and the British utilitarians, conclude that only valuings are real. Taking it that the dependence of values on valuings implies that valuings are independent of values is a strategy of pure independence, which understands everything Humpty Dumpty's way, as just a matter of who's to be master. If norms are not immediately authoritative over attitudes, then attitudes must be immediately authoritative over norms. Practically applying categories of immediacy, mastery, pure independence in this way, in the way epitomized by the Kammerdiner's niederträchtig meta-attitude, is a pure form of alienation, because it makes unintelligible the very acculturating conceptual norms subjection to which makes even the Kammerdiener a discursive, geistisch being, a knower, agent, and self. Kammerdiener explanations, which admit only normative attitudes, not only can't make sense of normative force, but also in the end make the notion of conceptual content unintelligible, Hegel will argue. The relation between these is the topic of the last part of the spirit section of the Phenomenology. Moving from the practically alienating standpoint of Verstand to the practically sittlich standpoint of Vernunft requires breaking out of the seeming inevitability of this restricted pair of alternatives. That is, either norms are immediately, hence totally authoritative over attitudes, or vice versa. It breaks out of that by making intelligible the possibility of reciprocal dependence between norm and attitude. To do that, it's not enough, of course, simply to mouth the phrase reciprocal dependence between norm and attitude. To make good on that phrase, Hegel offers a richly articulated metaconceptual apparatus laying out the nature of the complex interdependence of the authority of actual applications of concepts over the contents of those concepts, and the responsibility of actual applications of concepts to the contents of those concepts. It requires reconceiving the relations between normative force and conceptual content in terms of a process of experience, a cycle of perception and action, that is at once the institution and the application of conceptual norms. It is both a making and a finding of conceptual contents. His account of how that is possible requires the interaction of a social recognitive dimension and a historical recollective dimension on the side of normative pragmatics, and an incompatibility inferential and representational referential dimension on the side of semantics. There's a third, still more general issue being raised by the Kammerdiner's meta-attitude, beyond treating attitudes as purely independent of norms, which remain in the picture only in an adverbial capacity in an ultimately unsuccessful attempt to individuate the contents of the attitudes. That concerns the relation between reasons and causes generally, or still more abstractly, the place of norms in nature. For the Kammerdiener essentially treats the hero of duty as a merely natural being. The only way of making the hero's actions intelligible that the Kammerdiener admits are of the sort that are available in principle for unacculturated creatures, those merely immersed in the expanse of life, as Hegel says. Though the wants attributed to the hero, for instance, the inner moral conceit that consists in the enjoyment of being conscious of his own superiority and the foretaste of a human happiness, do go beyond the biologically dictated desires of mere animals. The Kammerdiner's view of the hero is as one who eats, drinks, and wears clothes. That is, at base, as a being driven by creaturely comforts and discomforts. The most general issue Hegel is addressing in his discussion of the Kammerdiener, though, is that of reductive naturalism about normativity. This sort of naturalism is the most fundamental possible challenge to the Kantian picture of us as normative creatures, as distinguished from the merely natural precisely by our subjection to norms, by the fact that we can bind ourselves by, make ourselves responsible to norms by applying concepts whose contents settle what we've made ourselves responsible for and to. Is there really any such thing as authority or responsibility, as commitment or entitlement? Or is that sort of normative talk wholly optional and dispensable, indeed a positively misleading mystification, a fundamental error of the sort of which Enlightenment accuses faith. For the Kammerdiener utilitarian, the work of Enlightenment is only half done when superstitious belief in a magical, invisible, supernatural, objective authority has been banished, so long as human behavior is still described in any terms that invoke norms and not immediately derivable from the sensuous inclinations of desiring beings. The Kammerdiener allegorically stands for a niederträchtig, relentlessly naturalistic alternative to this edelmütig normative description of concept use. In place of the picture of heroic practical sensitivity to norms, trying in deliberation and assessment to determine what's really correct, what one ought to do, what one's obliged to do, what duty consists in, acknowledging genuine normative constraint on one's attitudes, this meta-attitude appeals only to attitudes, which are not construed as the acknowledgement of any normative constraint on or authority over those attitudes. Reasons are traded for causes. It's this large-scale fundamental disagreement between the reductive naturalist and the rational normativist that Hegel's committed to resolving in his discussion of what the Kammerdiener gets right, what he gets wrong, and what lessons we should learn from him. This project, broadly construed, is to provide a response to Kant's third antinomy, the challenge to integrate reasons and causes. A significant proportion of Hegel's claim to contemporary philosophical attention, I think, should be seen as deriving from his response to this issue of normative naturalism. So the stakes are very high. Hegel takes it that he shares with Kant at least the aspiration for an account that manages to acknowledge both the attitude dependence of norms and their genuine authority over attitudes. That's why the Kantian structure of Moralität opens the third section of the Spirit chapter. Kant's view is transitional between the alienated modernity epitomized by the moral valet and a new kind of Sittlichkeit, compatible with the rise of subjectivity. For Hegel, Kant opens the door to the third structural stage in the development of self-conscious spirit, even though he doesn't succeed in helping us through that door. For Kant's conception of us as creatures who are bound not just by rules, the laws that govern the realm of nature, but by conceptions or representations, Vorstellungen, of rules, the norms that govern the realm of freedom, together with the tight conceptual connection he insists on between autonomy and normativity, express an attempt to reconcile the attitude dependence of norms with their genuine bindingness. All genuinely normative binding, authority, is for Kant self-binding. In the end, each of us is committed only to what we have committed ourselves to. Our real commitments are just those that we have at least implicitly acknowledged. In this sense, it's our attitudes that bring norms into force. We apply the concepts that only then bind us by determining what we have authorized and made ourselves responsible to and for. This is what I've called the Kant-Rousseau demarcation of the normative in terms of autonomy. This approach offers a structural solution to the reconciliation of the attitude dependence of norms and the norm dependence of attitudes that appeals to a distinction between the force of conceptual norms and their content. It's up to us, as knowers and agents, what norms we bring into force, for it's up to us what concepts we apply. But it is not then up to us what the content of those norms is, the details of what we've committed ourselves to by applying the concepts we did rather than some others. The general thought behind the Kammerdiener is that the possibility of offering a certain kind of genealogical account of the process by which conceptual content developed or was determined can seem to undercut the rational bindingness of the norm that has that content. This is a form of argument that was deployed by devastating effect by the great unmaskers of the late 19th century. Suppose that the correct answer to the question of why we draw the distinction between right and wrong as we do in some area of discourse is a causal explanation in terms of economic class structure, or a quasi-biological account in terms of the limited number of ways the will to power can manifest itself in the weak, or a description of how early traumas incurred while acting out the family romance reliably recathect libido into standard repressed adult forms. If any such genealogy can causally explain why our normative attitudes have the contents they do, why we make the judgments we do instead of some others, then the issue of the rational justifiability of those attitudes lapses. We appear to have reasons for our deliberations and assessments, and it may be comforting to ourselves to think that that's why they have the contents they do. But talk about what reasons there are for adopting one attitude rather than another is, on this sort of genealogical story, unmasked by a convincing genealogy of the process as mere appearance. The genealogy tells us what's really going on by presenting the underlying mechanism actually responsible for us taking this rather than that as appropriate, fitting, or correct, for adopting this or that attitude. Seeing ourselves as creatures who are genuinely sensitive to reasons, who are trying to figure out what is in fact appropriate, fitting, or correct, what we really have reason to do, then comes to seem naive and old-fashioned, the result of applying an exploded explanatory framework couched in a fanciful vocabulary, whose adoption can itself be explained away genealogically as the result of a process quite different from the reasoning to which it pretends. A clear illustration of how a genealogy of content can undercut normative force is found in the principle model that I've suggested for Hegel's account of conceptual content, the way concepts of common law develop through the decisions of judges to apply them or withhold application of them in particular cases. I originally invoked this example as a model of the way in which a process of applying conceptual norms in making judgments and practical decisions can also serve to institute conceptual norms and determine their contents. But the key point in the present context is that there's nothing outside the previous judge's decisions to determine the contents of the concepts each judge must apply in a new case. Those prior cases are the only source of reasons for the current judge to apply or not apply the concepts in question to a new set of facts. Here, too, a genealogical characterization of the process is possible. For in each of the prior cases appealed to in justifying a contemporary judgment, it may be possible to explain the earlier decision by appealing to what caused the judgment, rather than what reasons there were for it. One may be able to account for the precedential decision by looking at, in the slogan of jurisprudential theory, what the judge had for breakfast. Less fancifully, such a genealogical explanation might invoke the nature of the judge's training, the prejudices of his teachers, the opinions of his culture circle, his career ambitions, the political emphases, issues, and pressures of the day, and so on. Playing the moral valet to the judge is offering such a genealogical account of a judgment, revealing it not as a response to reasons properly provided by precedent and principle, not a matter of acknowledging as binding the content of an antecedent norm, but as the product of extrajudicial, rationally extraneous motives and considerations. Such genealogical accounts reveal the contingency of the conceptual content a later judge inherits for the tradition. For they make clear that had various judges happened to have had different breakfasts, had the contingencies the Kammerdiener appeals to as causes been different, the current content of the concept would have been different. Different decisions would have been made in the past and would accordingly have provided a different field of possible precedents. In fact, it's a commonplace of jurisprudential genealogy that another sort of contingency infects the process. For it's often clear that the order in which various difficult cases arose crucially affects the contents that emerge from the process. In such situations, the present case of the law would be very different had the case that happened to arise for adjudication later had to be decided before the one that in fact came up first. Similar contingencies affecting the content of concepts handed down as precedents derive from the happenstance of what particular jurisdiction a particular set of facts arises in. The issue I want to focus on is how the availability of such a contingency-riddled genealogical explanation for why the concept currently has the concept that it does affects the intelligibility of the norm embodied in that concept as rationally binding, as providing genuine reasons for the current decision to go one way rather than another. This is the issue of the relation between genealogy and justification. There's a temptation, indulged and fostered by the genealogical tradition, that stretches from Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud in the 19th century, at least through Foucault at the end of the 20th. A temptation to take it that explanations in terms of causes trump explanations in terms of reasons, showing the latter to be illusory. Exhibiting the contingent features of things, not addressed by a conceptual content or commitment, the features of things that caused it to be as it is, unmasks talk of reasons as irrelevant mystification. Niederträchtige explanations take precedence over edelmütig ones. Why should that be? The answer, I think, lies in ways of thinking about reason that are deeply rooted in the philosophical tradition. Both the ancients and the moderns defined reason in part by what it excludes. The Greeks introduced the notion of reason in terms of the contrast between rational persuasion and sophistical ways of producing attitudes. The distinction between what ought to convince and what merely in fact does convince. One explains the advent of the first sort of attitude by rehearsing an argument. One explains the advent of the second sort of attitude by producing a genealogy. The Enlightenment notion of reason is similarly structured by the contrast between the rational authority of argument and the merely habitual influence of tradition, between what we ought to believe and what we merely, as a matter of fact, have believed. When Enlightenment offers a genealogy of religious belief in terms of the interests of priests and despots, or describes the contingent processes by which Scripture was transmitted, it understands itself as undercutting the rational authority of faith. Both the ancient and the modern conceptions of reason motivate a project of purifying reason by extruding the alien extraneous influence of what is merely in fact efficacious in bringing about beliefs and other attitudes. On their conceptions, what merely as a matter of fact is or has been believed, the judgments, applications of concepts that have in fact been endorsed, actual attitudes, should be granted no rational weight or force, that is, no authority. Kant is only making fully explicit a way of thinking that's already fully in play in Descartes' Meditations, when he decisively separates causal from justificatory grounding, criticizing Locke for producing, in effect, a mere genealogy of empirical beliefs rather than an account of how they're rationally warranted. Hegel thinks that reason, as so purified, is reduced to something empty, contentless, and purely formal, and so inevitably set on a road that leads to skepticism. Hegel's notion of reason is not opposed to the authority of tradition. It's an aspect of it. What merely is does have rational, defeasible authority. The attitudes we've actually adopted have rational, though defeasible, authority. He says, the actual, the wirklich, is the rational is the actual. How we have in the past actually applied a concept, from one point of view contingently, because not necessitated by the norm antecedently in play, helps to determine how it is correct to apply it. Conceptual norms incorporate contingency, and only so can they be determinately contentful. This is how they came to be about what there actually is, to represent, not in an external sense, but in a sense that involves incorporating into the representing reference to what's represented. I think the later Wittgenstein was worried about this issue. I think he saw the temptation to see a demonstration of the parochiality of the content of a norm, its dependence on or reflection of certain kinds of contingent features of the practitioners and practices, the temptation to see that as undercutting the intelligibility of that norm as genuinely binding, as being a real norm, as having normative force. Wittgenstein does not, as Hegel does, take it that to be determinately contentful at all, a norm must have a conceptual content. Though he does take the considerations about the dependence of the content of norms on contingent matters of fact to apply also to the case of the conceptual norms expressed by terms such as rigid in one of his examples. The effect of the contingency of their content on the rational bindingness of our norms is accordingly not exactly the way to put Wittgenstein's problem. But he does worry about the thought that showing, for instance, that what counts as the right way to go on, depends on a reproducible consilience in how practitioners actually would go on, makes mysterious the sense in which there is a right way to go on, a difference between doing so correctly and incorrectly. And I take it that he's concerned both to reject that inference and to diagnose it as the consequence of a traditional but ultimately magical notion of normative force. The effect of the demonstration of the parochiality and contingency of the practices in which our norms are implicit is not meant to be normative nihilism. Rather, space is opened up for new ways of construing the relations between genealogy and justification. The issue of how to recover a sense in which conceptual norms can be understood as genuinely binding in the face of the revelation of the contingency of their content by a genealogical account of their origin and development is particularly pressing for Hegel, because his response to what he takes to be Kant's uncritical attitude towards determinate conceptual contents is to offer a conception of experience as a single process that is at once the application and the institution of conceptual norms. That's one of the things that the common law model is a model of. I've suggested elsewhere as a slogan that in this regard, Hegel is to Kant as Quine is to Carnap. Each replaces a two-phase story, according to which first, meanings or conceptual contents are specified, and then, only at the second phase, are they applied to make judgments. That is, language first, then theory. Each of Quine and Hegel replaces such a two-phase story by a one-phase story, in which the two functions, applying the norms and instituting the norms, are intermingled. Quine says, all we do is use the language. That has to make it mean what it means, as well as commit us to how things are. Kammerdiener genealogies pose a threat to pragmatists of this sort. The possibility of a norm-free, niederträchtig account threatens the justifiability and even the intelligibility of norm-acknowledging edelmutig accounts. And for Hegel, the issue concerns the rational force of conceptual norms, their capacity to provide real reasons for saying or doing one thing rather than another. In situating edelmutig characterizations of our discursive practice with respect to niederträchtig ones, Hegel will be explaining how we should understand the normative force of a reason and what it consists in. To repeat my earlier observation, the stakes are high. In order to see what the Hegelian account of the relation between normative pragmatic force, articulated by the distinction between norm and attitude, and semantic content, add to the story about the Hegelian version of the Fregean semantic distinction between sense and reference, it's important to be clear about the nature of the distinction between two meta-attitudes toward the relation between norms and attitudes, namely Niederträchtigkeit and Edelmutigkeit. There are four different ways of thinking about that distinction, four different statuses it can have. They're progressively more insightful and sophisticated, representing an expressive progression. The cumulative emergence into explicitness of implicit features of the relations between norms and attitudes that correspond to the stages by which Hegel sees spirit as a whole as developing its self-consciousness. The first way of understanding the relation between the edelmutig normativist and the niederträchtig naturalist is as a cognitive disagreement about a matter of objective fact. They disagree about the correct answer to the question, are there norms or not? If one makes an exhaustive catalog of the furniture of the universe, will one find norms in it or only normative attitudes? On this way of construing it, the issue is put in a box with the question of whether there are leprechauns or whether there's a bird in that bush. One or the other party to the dispute is wrong. Who's right and who's wrong is settled by an attitude-independent matter of fact, in the sense that whether there are norms or not is not reference dependent on the meta-attitudes of the normativist or the naturalist. On the side of epistemology, rather than ontology, the normativist takes it that normative attitudes are themselves cognitive attitudes, and that at least when things go right, they involve knowledge of norms. The hero may in fact know what his duty is and do it because it is his duty. The objectivist meta attitude toward the issue takes it additionally that both the normative and the naturalist attitudes are themselves cognitive attitudes, only one of which can be right about what there really is. This objectivist cognitivist way of understanding the status of the two meta-attitudes, Edelmütigkeit and Niederträchtigkeit, understanding the status of the two meta-attitudes towards norms and normative attitudes, isn't the only one available, though. It's possible to adopt instead an almost diametrically opposed subjectivist meta-meta attitude. According to this way of thinking, the normativist and the naturalist employ different vocabularies in describing the world. Using one rather than the other is something like adopting a stance. The two stances are incompatible. One can't adopt them both. One either uses normative vocabulary or one does not. But both of them are available and both of them are legitimate. Remember, Hegel said, just as every action is capable of being looked at from the point of conformity to duty, so too it can be considered from the point of view of the particularity of the doer. As for the legitimacy of the reductive Niederträchtig attitude, Hegel acknowledges that the Kammerdiener is not wrong. He says, no action can escape such judgment. There is no action in which it could not oppose to the universal aspect of the action the personal aspect of the individuality and play the part of the moral valet to the agent. End of that quote. Every intentional action is charged with the aspect of particularity, in his phrase, in that the agent must have had some motive for performing it, some attitude that was efficacious in bringing it about. Norms are efficacious only through attitudes towards them. So one can always short-circuit explanations that appeal to the norms the attitudes are directed toward, what the agent ought to do, her duty, appealing only to the attitudes themselves. In the broader reading, I take it that Hegel is acknowledging the possibility of purely naturalistic descriptions of the world, including human actions. Just so, every action is capable of being looked at from the point of view of conformity to duty, that is, in the Edelmütig normative vocabulary. What shows up in the causal psychological vocabulary of the Kammerdiener is nature, natural beings, and natural processes, the world of desire. What shows up in the normative vocabulary of the hero is spirit, geistisch beings, and discursive practices, the world of recognition. The realm of spirit comprises experience and agency. It's a structure articulated by relations of authority and responsibility, of commitment and entitlement, of reasons and concepts, with their obligations and permissions that they involve and articulate. This normative discursive realm of spirit is Hegel's topic. That's why the book is called The Phenomenologie des Geistes. And it too is real, according to this meta-meta stance. According to this meta-meta attitude, the reductive naturalist is wrong to take it that the explanatory completeness of the naturalistic causal vocabulary in its own terms indicates its expressive completeness, so that any claims it can't express can't be true. For it must leave out concept use as such, and hence the whole geistisch dimension of human activity, even though every application of concept in judgment and action can be explained in naturalistic terms, if it's described in naturalistic terms of noises and motions. But the normative vocabulary is also sovereign and comprehensive within its domain and can achieve a corresponding explanatory equilibrium. For it's a vocabulary for describing the use of vocabularies, including the vocabulary of natural science. Everything the scientist does, no less than the activities and practices of other discursive beings, can be described in the language of judgment, intentional action, and recognition. The Kammerdiener's attitude, too, is, after all, a discursive attitude. One of the great questions of modernity, transposed into a new key by Kant's normative reconceptualization of it, concerns the relation between spirit and nature. As Hegel says at the end of his lectures on the history of philosophy, Nature and the world or history of spirit are the two realities. The ultimate aim and business of philosophy is to reconcile thought, or the notion, the Begriff, with reality. One strategy for doing that is to see the naturalistic and normative vocabularies as incommensurable, but as each providing a legitimate, valid, in some sense, comprehensive perspective on things. They're understood as just expressing different features of things. The choice of which to employ in any particular case can then be understood to be pragmatic in the classical sense, a matter of what best conduces to securing the ends and interests motivating the subject making the choice of vocabulary at that time. Rather than disagreeing about an objective matter of fact, the naturalist and the normativist are seen as expressing different subjective preferences, adopting different attitudes, which reflect their different interests. Whichever vocabulary one adopts makes possible genuine knowledge of some aspect of how things really are. Now, there's something right about this pragmatic, perspectival way of construing the relations between what's expressed by normative and naturalistic vocabularies. But the conception of Niederträchtigkeit and Edelmütigkeit as still basically cognitive stances misses something essential to Hegel's approach. When he introduces it, Hegel said that the Niederträchtig meta-attitude, quote, clings to the disparity between the two essentialities, the distinction that action and actual consciousness involve. This is a partial, one-sided attitude. The Edelmütig meta-attitude seizes one-sidedly instead on the complementary moment of unity or identity. We've seen various ways of conceptualizing these formal aspects of discursive activity, corresponding to different ways of thinking about what's distinguished or united. Judging and acting are species of concept application, so they involve a distinction between a universal and a particular to which it's applied, and their unity in an individual. That is, a particular is characterized by a universal. The universal is the concept being applied, what sets the standard of correctness of the judgment or the action. On the broad construal, the Niederträchtig attitude does not admit that there are standards of correctness, norms, in play at all. The particulars are actual and real, the universals are illusory. There are no genuine individuals that really unite universals and particulars. The issue comes up explicitly for intentional action. The Kammerdiener does not admit that what is done can be acknowledged, can be acknowledgments of the bindingness of a norm, can be simply the application of that norm to a particular. There are just particular performances, but no question of them genuinely falling under norms, according to which they can be assessed. Judgments and action as such are visible only from the Edelmütig point of view, which discerns the unity and hence the content of consciousness and action. So far, that characterization is compatible with a purely cognitive reading of the two meta-attitudes. But immediately after the Kammerdiener passage, Hegel says of the moral valet, the consciousness that judges in this way is itself base, niederträchtig, because it divides up the action, producing and holding fast to the disparity of the action with itself. That is, adopting the Niederträchtig meta-attitude not only holds fast to the disparity of the action with itself, but divides up the action and produces the disparity. This sounds more like a practical than a cognitive matter, a matter of making something, not just finding something. Well, in what sense then does the moral valet produce the disparity? It can't be that what he produces is what Hegel calls the distinction that action implies. For that distinction between achievement and intention, between the context of assessment and the context of deliberation, between particular performance and universal conceptual norm that sets a standard of correctness for it, that distinction is a ubiquitous and essential part of the metaphysical structure of action. That distinction is not a product of modern alienation. Alienation is only one structure that a practical conception of that distinction can take. That alienated structure of agency is what the Kammerdiener produces by adopting the reductive Niederträchtig attitude, which denies that knowers and agents are genuinely sensitive to conceptual norms. The claim is that adopting the Niederträchtig normative meta-attitude institutes a kind of normativity that has a distinctive, defective structure. To say that is to say that Niederträchtigkeit is in the first instance a kind of recognition rather than of cognition. After all, recognition in general is taking someone to be a subject of normative statuses and attitudes, hence a knower and agent. And specific recognition is attributing particular normative statuses and attitudes. The magnanimous historian, who takes the hero to be genuinely sensitive to and acknowledging norms beyond his own desires, recognizes the hero in a very different sense than does the one who plays the moral valet to him. Just so, Enlightenment's taking faith to consist in a simple cognitive mistake is taking up a recognitive stance to faith. It not only makes a cognitive mistake when it takes faith's defining commitments to be cognitive rather than recognitive, belief in the existence of a peculiar kind of thing rather than instituting a community of trust, Enlightenment in that case also commits a recognitive injustice. Hegel says, quote, "Faith receives at Enlightenment's hands nothing but wrong, for Enlightenment distorts all the moments of faith, changing them into something different than what they are in it." To faith, Enlightenment seems to be a perversion and a lie, because it points out the otherness of its moments. In doing so, it seems directly to make something else out of them than they are in their separateness. End of the quote. Its ungenerous, niederträchtig failure to recognize faith's recognitive achievement changes that achievement, makes it less than it would be if it were properly acknowledged by Enlightenment. By adopting that attitude, by playing the moral valet to faith, refusing proper recognition, Enlightenment rejects community with faith, makes impossible the reciprocal recognition that would institute a community exhibiting the structure of trust, and it pushes the corresponding sort of self-consciousness out of reach. The moral valet does not just notice or point out the disparity that action and consciousness involves, he identifies with it. For his recognitive act is also a recognitive sacrifice. What the Kammerdiener gives up is the possibility of a certain kind of self-consciousness, consciousness of himself as genuinely bound by norms. The principled grounds he has for refusing to recognize the hero as a norm-governed creature apply to himself as well, of course. His position is that the idea of someone practically acknowledging a norm as binding is unintelligible. That characterization may seem wrong, at least for the narrow literal construal of the Kammerdiener story. After all, he does attribute practical reasoning and hence concept use to the hero, just nothing that's not immediately self-serving, the satisfaction of some actual contingent motivating desire or attitude. So he does, in some sense, recognize the hero as a discursive being. But the claim will be that this is an unstable kind of recognition. If all anyone can do is fulfill felt desires, then concept use is not in the end intelligible as such. The argument is the one Hegel rehearsed for what he called the conscientious consciousness, a notion of duty showing some sort of independence from attitudes is needed to give content to the idea of assessing performances accordingly as they were or were not performed out of a conviction that they were what duty demanded. Failing to appreciate that that was the flaw diagnosed. Failing to appreciate that was the flaw diagnosed in the conscientious normative self-consciousness. Normative attitudes are not in the end intelligible as contentful, apart from the norms that identify and individuate their contents. What the Kammerdiener is doing by adopting the Niederträchtig recognitive stance is making his own and other performances and practices into something that's unintelligible in the end as discursive. The third construal of the Niederträchtig and Edelmütig meta-attitudes towards norms and normative attitudes is then that they're recognitive attitudes that have the effect of practical commitments. Adopting the Edelmütig stance of spirit is committing oneself to making what we are doing, being binding ourselves by conceptual norms, so acknowledging the authority of such norms, to make that so by practically taking it that that is what we're doing, by recognitively treating ourselves and our fellows as doing that. On this view, normativity, which because the norms in question are for Hegel all conceptually contentful, is the same phenomenon as rationality. Normativity and rationality are not features of our practices independent of our practical meta-attitude towards those practices. Quote, "To him who looks on the world rationally, the world looks rationally back," Hegel says. Normativity and rationality on this view are products of our edelmutig meta-attitudes, of our practically taking or treating what we're doing, recognizing each other, as acknowledging rational commitments. Spirit exists insofar as we make it exist by taking it to exist, by understanding what we're doing in normative rational terms. We make the world rational by adopting the recognitively structured constellation of commitments and responsibilities that I have denominated trust, following Hegel's usage in connection with the kind of community faith is committed to instituting. That means that spirit is brought into existence and sustained by our recollective commitment to rationally reconstruct the tradition of experience in Whiggish terms, finding trajectories through it that are expressively progressive, that exhibit what we've been doing as the unfolding into explicitness of norms that were all along implicit. This third understanding of meta-attitudes of Niederträchtigkeit and Edelmütigkeit as practical, recognitive, hence community and self-constitutive, like the second conception, still presents them as options available for subjects freely to choose between. It's up to us whether to make ourselves into merely natural or genuinely normative beings. On this account, Hegel might be urging us not to make the Kammerdiener's choice, but he's not claiming that we're compelled to do that. There is, however, a fourth way of understanding the status of these two stances. Its leading thought is that we've always already implicitly committed ourselves to adopting the edelmutig stance, to identifying with the unity that action and consciousness involve, to understanding ourselves as genuinely binding ourselves by conceptual norms that we apply in acting intentionally and making judgments. For we do judge and act, and we cannot avoid in practice taking or treating those judgments and actions as determinately contentful, as materially incompatible with certain other judgments and actions, and materially entailing still others. We count some judgments as reasons for or against others, and some intentions and plans as ruling out or requiring others as means. Even the Kammerdiener, in his resolutely reductive naturalist generalization, offer contentful accounts of our doings, performances, and attitudes, accounts that aim to satisfy the distinctive standards of intelligibility, adequacy, and correctness to which they hold themselves. If the determinate contentfulness of the thoughts and intentions, even of the Niederträchtig, is in fact intelligible only from an edelmutig perspective, then anyone who in practice treats what he's doing as judging and acting is implicitly committed thereby to edelmutigkeit. The semantic theory that I extract from the phenomenology has as its conclusion the antecedent of that conditional. And if that's all right, then the apparent parity between the two metanormative stances is an illusion. No genuine choice between them is possible. By talking, thinking, engaging in discursive practices at all, we've always already implicitly endorsed and adopted one of them, whether we explicitly realize it or not. On this reading, what Hegel is asking us to do is only explicitly to acknowledge theoretical and practical commitments that we've already implicitly undertaken just by taking part in discursive practices, which is to say, by being acculturated. Explicitly adopting the edelmutig, practical recognitive attitude is accordingly just achieving a certain kind of self-consciousness, realizing something that's already true of ourselves. So the issue in the end is, in a sense, a broadly cognitive one, a matter of finding out how things, in some sense, already are. But the achievement of this definitive kind of self-consciousness is always, as must be so according to Hegel's social account of what self-consciousness consists in, the adoption of a distinctive kind of recognitive relation to others and to oneself. The realization that edelmutigkeit simply consists in doing explicitly what one has implicitly committed oneself to do by adopting discursive attitudes and engaging in discursive practices, also exhibits that recognitive attitude as, in a broad sense, a moral necessity, in a sense that develops a Kantian idea. This is part of the reason Hegel's expository development of his novel positive account of the shape of an explicitly edelmütig reciprocal recognitive relation closes the section that he's titled Moralität. Kant seeks to ground moral imperatives in the presuppositions of rationality and discursivity, hence normativity, and the sort of positive freedom that consists in being able to bind oneself by conceptual norms. His thought is that whatever can be shown to be a necessary condition of being a knower and an agent at all is thereby shown to have a grip on us that's unconditional, in the sense of it not being relative to any particular endorsement or commitment of ours, whether theoretical or practical. Hegel tells a different story than Kant does about the relations between treating others as one minimally must in order to be treating them as rational, discursive, norm-governed free beings, that is, recognizing them, on the one hand, and one's self-consciousness as oneself rational, discursive, norm-governed, and free. But Hegel takes over the idea that recognizably moral norms are to be derived from the presuppositions of discursivity in general. Self-recognition, recognizing oneself, treating oneself as a discursive being, as able to undertake determinately contentful commitments, exercise determinately contentful authority, and so on, requires recognizing others, attributing that kind of responsibility and authority to them. Any practical or theoretical presupposition of that is a structural presupposition of one's own self-consciousness. That's the source of what we can call moral requirements on how we treat others. Transposed into the key of Hegel's expressive idiom, edification concerning what is necessary shows up as the making explicit, making it für sich, of what is already implicitly, an sich, what we're already implicitly committed to. Doing that always has both a cognitive aspect of finding out how things already really were in themselves, and a recognitive aspect of self-transformation and constitution of oneself as a new kind of self-consciousness. In my final lecture tomorrow, I'll talk about that final form of reciprocal recognition and the normativity that it institutes. Thank you.